The crystal chandeliers glowed brilliantly, suspended high above the ceiling of the New York Plaza Hall, their light breaking into thousands of tiny fragments like a symphony written in glass. The string orchestra in the corner played softly, each note blending with the faint clink of crystal glasses, like the grand opening of an extravagant play. Laughter echoed throughout, so vibrant it felt as though the entire city was leaning in to listen. But right in the middle of all that splendor, Edward Hamilton sat in silence. His figure stood out not because of the fine suit he wore, but because of the unusual stillness amid the noisy celebration. 39 years old, once a millionaire who built an entire financial empire, he now seemed like a low note out of place in a symphony far too dazzling. In front of him lay an ivory invitation card with silver edges, not large in size, yet its weight pressed down on his chest like a stone. Edward stared at it, then searched for ways to avoid it, then longed for a miracle to make it disappear. But the words remained, cold and sharp. Veronica Carter cordially invites you to attend the 10th anniversary celebration of Sterling Corporation. His chest tightened. His hand trembled. His pride was being torn apart, not by a sharp blade, quick and clean, but by a dull knife, carving piece by piece, never enough to kill instantly, but more than enough to turn every breath into torment. Edward lifted his gaze, sweeping across the room now filled with guests. Familiar faces from the world of finance, businessmen who once raised their glasses to him when he stood at the top. Now they surrounded Veronica, his ex-wife, radiant in a red gown, every gesture like a queen upon her throne. The glow from the chandeliers seemed to lean in her direction. In Edward's mind, questions thundered. He looked, he searched, he longed, like a man drowning, grasping desperately for an anchor, a foothold, a lifeline. But all around him were only laughter, condescending glances, and poisonous whispers. He really came. Look at him, sitting in the corner like a failure. Veronica truly knows how to parade the past. Each whisper slipped into Edward's ears like shards of glass, tiny, sharp, and icy, yet enough to draw blood from the soul. He forced his face into calmness, but inside, anger surged, boiling like fire trapped in a cage. A voice hissed in his head. I will not let her humiliate me. Not again. Not ever. Memories of their marriage rushed back, the cold nights in their lavish mansion, the endless arguments, and finally the betrayal, silent yet lethal. Veronica had not only walked away, but she had also taken a part in his honor and wielded it as a weapon to build her own power. Now, at the very banquet she hosted, Edward was being dragged back onto the battlefield, old wounds transformed into a challenge. He gripped the wineglass in his hand tightly. The alcohol burned strongly, but not enough to numb the sting, not enough to wash away the shame, but enough to awaken his resolve. In the dark depths of his eyes, a flash of determination lit up. I will not appear here alone. I will make her stumble, right in her own grand hall. That thought took root, spreading like fire in the night. Edward drew in a deep breath. The shame that once filled his chest slowly gave way to cold, steady resolve. He knew that tonight, a reckless decision would be born out of wounded pride. The music still played, the lights still gleamed, but inside Edward, another symphony had begun, the symphony of challenge, of retaliation, of a rematch no one had seen coming. Edward Hamilton still sat in the chair in the corner of the hall, the taste of strong liquor lingering on his lips. But the thought that had just flickered in his mind had already become a flame that could not be extinguished. The entire room blazed with light, the pounding music stirring up memories and old wounds. He had once walked into this place with his head held high and welcomed as a guest of honor. Now, he was nothing more than a shadow whispered about and mocked. If I show up alone, I'll just be their amusement. But if I arrive with someone by my side, what then? The thought echoed, slow yet firm. Edward leaned back, trying to keep his expression indifferent. But inside his chest, the question dug deep. If he walked in with another woman, someone no one could predict, someone who would make the entire hall turn its head, would that be enough to shake Veronica Carter? He asked himself. If I choose wrong, this will turn into a farce. But if I choose right, it will be a counterattack. The glass in his hand trembled slightly, reflecting the chandelier's glow into countless tiny shards of light. It was like a reminder that he was standing between two shores to remain the humiliated man, or to risk everything to take back the initiative. Beyond, the whispers continued to ripple. He's nothing but an empty shell. Showing up won't change a thing. Veronica has already won. Those words only fanned the flames inside Edward. He closed his eyes and drew in a long breath. The image of Veronica in her proud red dress flashed before him again. She wasn't just celebrating 10 years with her company. She wanted to turn this party into a public play to humiliate him. Then, he muttered in his mind, as if calculating a life or death equation. If I walk in with an ordinary woman, they'll sneer. If I arrive with a stranger, they'll gossip. But if she has the strength to stand beside me, the gaze of the entire hall will shift. He knew what he needed: an element of surprise, a figure no one would expect. Not a powerful businesswoman, too predictable. Not a glamorous model, too shallow. He needed contrast, a choice that would make the entire crowd hesitate. His hand tapped lightly on the table, like a rhythm of careful weighing. From deep within, an incomplete yet undeniable answer rose. He would not walk in alone. That resolve eased his face slightly. The icy blood moments ago was replaced by the quickened pulse of a man who had just conceived a daring reversal. Inside his head, Edward heard his own whisper, "I won't lose. Even if I have to gamble, I won't lose." His eyes were fixed on the silver invitation card, where Veronica Carter's name still sat, arrogant and taunting. But this time, his gaze no longer avoided it. It was sharper, like a blade kept hidden in its sheath, waiting to be drawn. The ballroom remained radiant, the notes of music still lingering. But in Edward's mind, a plan had already been set in motion. He would find someone ordinary enough to be unexpected, yet extraordinary enough to shift every stare. And then, he would stride into that room no longer alone, but as a declaration of war. In the swirl of that emotion, Edward stood up, the glass in his hand tilting, its contents shimmering. He did not know how it would end, but he knew the only path left to reclaim the pride that had been stolen was this reckless one. The afternoon rain in New York swept across Lexington Avenue, leaving the sidewalks mottled with puddles. Neon lights reflected on the slick pavement, flickering like fragmented memories. Edward Hamilton walked briskly, his dark coat clinging to his rigid frame. In his mind, the plan that had just taken shape still echoed. He needed a companion, a presence surprising enough to turn the entire Veronica ballroom upside down. A small diner on the corner came into view. The glass door was fogged with condensation, and inside the warm yellow lights fell across scratched wooden tables. Edward pushed the door open, the bell above it ringing with a dry chime. The simplicity of the place stood in stark contrast to the crystal ballrooms he had just left behind. But it was here that fate was waiting. At the far end of the diner, a young woman was clearing a table. Her hair was tied high, her white shirt frayed at the edges, her apron stained with coffee. Her movements were swift and precise, yet her eyes carried a faint weariness. When she looked up, her gaze met Edward's directly, neither avoiding nor hesitating. He stepped closer. "Give me a cup of coffee." Her voice was soft yet steady. "Sit wherever you like. But the coffee here is bitter, not for those used to sweets." Edward's lips curved faintly. A line that seemed ordinary struck him like a blade tapping against his heartbeat. He sat down, studying every gesture. This waitress was unlike the others who bowed their heads. In her eyes was something else, a quiet defiance, an experience she couldn't quite hide. When she set the cup of coffee down, Edward asked directly, "What's your name?" She looked up, her eyes cold, and answered curtly, "Clara Evans." The name dropped, sharp as the snip of scissors. Edward felt a flicker of familiarity. He studied her more closely, trying to recall. "Before, did you attend Harvard?" He guessed, his tone half surprised, half probing. Clara froze for a moment, then smirked. "You look at me like some old experiment. Yes, I studied there. Then I left. Now I wash glasses and carry trays. Is that a problem?" Edward fell silent. The reply struck like a slap. He hadn't expected that beneath the worn apron was once a brilliant past. That very contrast made her make a choice no one in the Sterling ballroom could ever anticipate. He tried again, his voice lower. "Tomorrow night, I need someone to go with me. Not for decoration, but to face an entire hall." Clara let out a short laugh, her eyes gleaming with faint mockery. "You want to drag a waitress into a high society party so they can laugh at us both?" Edward leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "No, I want them to fall silent." The air tightened between them. Outside, the rain began tapping on the tin roof, pounding like a heartbeat. Clara clenched the rag in her hand, as if torn between refusal and curiosity. "You think I'll agree to be your pawn?" she asked, her voice sharp as steel. "Not a pawn, an ally," Edward replied, his eyes locked on hers. Clara gave a short, dry laugh, edged with bitterness. Then she shook her head, whispering just loud enough for him to hear, "You have no idea who you're pulling into your game." Edward looked deep into her eyes and saw both darkness and light, a truth not yet revealed. But he knew she was exactly the choice he needed, not only for the surprise, but for the strength hidden beneath her weariness. He lifted the cup of coffee, drained the bitter taste in one swallow, then set it down, speaking slowly, sealing the moment. "Tomorrow, walk in with me." Clara said nothing, but in her silence, her eyes sparked like a flame of defiance, a signal of a beginning no one could have predicted. Edward's apartment was on a high floor, its glass windows opening to a full view of New York at night. The city glowed like a tapestry inlaid with jade and fire. Clara Evans stood before the large mirror set in the middle of the living room, the warm golden light spilling down onto her face. Her hair, once hastily tied after a long shift, now fell loose, framing her deep eyes that held both exhaustion and defiance. Edward stood behind her, silent. He had never seen anyone embody such contradictions, both simple and proud. He pictured Clara walking into the Sterling ballroom tomorrow night under the chandeliers. She would no longer be an anonymous waitress. She would be the enigma that made every gaze pause. "Are you sure you want this?" Edward asked, his voice low but firm. Clara laid a silk scarf on the table and answered briskly, "I've grown used to judgmental stares. A few hundred more won't make any difference." He thought of saying more, then fell quiet. That answer was like armor. But behind that armor, he could sense an old wound. Clara reached up to adjust her hair. Her fingers trembled slightly, but in the mirror her eyes remained resolute. "Who do you want me to become?" The question slipped out, half mocking, half daring. Edward stepped forward and placed a black velvet box on the table. The lid clicked open, revealing a string of pure white pearls, gleaming beneath the light. Clara froze for a moment, not because of their value, but because of the memory. She had once worn pearls like these when she sat in the lecture halls of Harvard, before her life had derailed. "Not someone else," Edward said slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "Just yourself, but in a way, the whole world cannot ignore." His words peeled away a layer of smoke. Clara touched the pearls, cold against her fingertips. For a fleeting second, she saw the version of herself from years ago. A Clara who once strode confidently down the halls, who once had a radiant future. Then the image shattered. giving way to the present. She pressed her lips together and picked up the pearls. The mirror reflected the light back, as though her face was being reborn. Edward watched silently. In Clara's eyes, he saw a shift from guarded to sharp, from weary to luminous. A makeup artist, an old friend of Edward's, walked in carrying a kit. The atmosphere in the room changed. Brushes swept across her skin, powder as fine as mist, eyeliner sharpening her gaze. The reflection in the mirror did not just carve out her features. It awakened a self that had long been dormant. Clara sat still, but inside a storm raged. She could hear her own heartbeat, pounding like the overture of a play about to begin. In the mirror, each layer of makeup, each precise line, felt like a piece of her past being set back into place. When her hair was let down, softly curled, and when her lips were painted a deep crimson, Clara tilted her head slightly. The reflection left her stunned. For a moment, she almost did not recognize herself. Edward gave a faint smile, a rare one after so many long days. He whispered, as if speaking to her and to himself, "Tomorrow you won't walk in as a servant. You'll be the wind that sweeps through a suffocating room." Clara looked straight into the mirror, her lips barely moving. Rebirth, or just another disguise? Edward did not answer, but in his eyes there was a belief that sometimes even a disguise was enough to reignite a real flame. Beyond the windows, the city still burned with light. But inside the apartment, that moment felt like a ritual, Clara Evans preparing to become the version of herself she had once forgotten. The next night, the Sterling Hall lit up like a Broadway stage. Crystal chandeliers cascaded in layers of glittering light. The orchestra played the opening waltz, and the clicks of cameras echoed like fireworks in the enclosed room. Guests streamed in, radiant in their high society attire, as if waiting to witness a performance of power. Veronica Carter arrived early, a tight red gown, a cold, sharp smile. Every gaze turned to her, the woman who once transformed abandonment into a stepping stone of power. She held her head high, her eyes sweeping across the hall like a queen reviewing her troops. Then, the double doors opened. A man strode in. Edward Hamilton, once dismissed as a failure, it is now standing in the spotlight, and right beside him, Clara Evans. In that instant, the room froze. Every eye was fixed on them. Cameras swiveled frantically. Whispers rose like clashing notes of music. "Who is she? She's not one of us. Looks familiar, but can't quite place her." Clara walked alongside Edward, her high heels tapping against the marble floor. Each step stitched into the grand tapestry of the night, leaving behind a hidden thread. The black evening gown hugged her figure, while the white pearl necklace at her neck caught the light, making her face glow amid the sea of people. She did not bow her head, nor did she smile to please. Clara's gaze moved across each face as if unbothered by judgment. That composure was her power. Edward turned and caught her eyes. In that fleeting moment, he saw it clearly. She was not just an escort. She was the breeze he had once promised, sweeping into this suffocating room. Veronica paused for a beat, her smile faltering before snapping back in place. Yet her eyes flickered with unease. The whispers grew louder, crashing like relentless waves. Clara stepped forward, calm and steady, leaving a trail of resonance in the eyes of those watching. She needed no title, no introduction. Her very presence was the unanswered question hanging in the air. Who is she? Edward knew that this very moment had changed the game. He was no longer alone, no longer the man mocked in hushed tones. With one choice, he had turned his entrance into his first counterattack. The music continued to play, the lights continued to pour down, but the focus had shifted. In the midst of the elegant crowd, a mysterious figure had appeared, forcing everyone to confront themselves. Dear listener, can you feel the suffocating weight of this moment? Imagine if you were Edward. Would you have the courage to step into that grand hall with someone entirely unexpected by your side? Or if you were Clara, would you dare to face 100 judging eyes and remain utterly composed? Share your thoughts in the comments, for each reflection can open a new perspective. And if you wish to continue journeying through stories filled with emotion, surprises, and depth, don't forget to subscribe to The Soft Why. Your support is the very reason we can keep telling these heartfelt journeys. The Sterling Hall gradually settled after the initial commotion. The waltz melodies softly lifted the air, as if laying a thin velvet curtain over the tension. But beneath that velvet, the blade of words was already sharpened. Veronica Carter moved toward Edward Hamilton and Clara Evans. Every step radiated the confidence honed from years of standing at the center of power. Guests gently shifted aside, leaving a space like a frame for the three of them to appear together. "Edward," Veronica spoke, her smile curved, her tone clear but tipped with a hidden edge. "What a surprise to see you. Not alone." Edward kept his gaze steady. His voice was low, firm. "Surprises are sometimes the most interesting part of a party. Don't you think, Veronica?" Clara stood beside him, quiet. Her eyes swept across Veronica. No bow, no awkwardness. Just a slight nod, polite, yet distant. Veronica turned, her eyes resting on Clara. "And this is—" The question rang out like a pair of scissors tearing fabric, loud enough for those around them to hear. Edward opened his mouth, but Clara stepped in first, her voice even Clara Evans. Veronica's brows drew together, a flicker of recognition flashing across her face. But instantly, she laughed, the sound like crystal glasses colliding. "Ah, the name rings a bell. I once heard about a Harvard student who dropped out. Such a pity. I always thought that environment wasn't made for everyone." The sound fell, smooth as velvet but sharp as a blade, a blessing wrapped in silk with a knife hidden inside. Clara didn't blink. She gave a faint smile, her voice steady. "That's true. It isn't made for everyone, but sometimes walking away is the only way to truly see yourself." The crowd stirred slightly. A few exchanged glances. A few forced smiles appeared. Edward watched the two women face each other, feeling the current of tension surge between them. He cut in, his tone slow but clear. "Veronica, you're as skillful as ever. I used to wonder, is there ever anything you say that doesn't carry a second meaning?" Veronica turned toward him, her gaze sharp as jade carved into a blade. "Edward, you're still as suspicious as before. I used to think that suspicion cost you more than it gave, but perhaps it's what kept you standing." Her words poured down like strong liquor, both praise and jab, tying the past to the present. Clara glanced at Edward, noticing the way his jaw tightened. In his eyes, a flicker of anger, like fire caged in iron. But when he spoke, only cold composure remained. "There are things I once lost. But at least I haven't lost the ability to see someone's true face." The silence that followed was heavy. Veronica kept her smile, but her hand tightened slightly on her glass. Clara caught it just for a moment, the faint falter in her eyes. The crowd buzzed again. A middle-aged man whispered, "This tension, it's too much." The woman next to him replied, "It's like they're playing chess with words." The music still played, the lights still shone. But within the circle, those three were acting out a private drama. Every sentence was a move, every smile is a mask, and somewhere in that exchange, the beginning of a real confrontation had already taken root. The music shifted, and the string orchestra began to play a tender waltz. The steady three-beat rhythm flowed like gentle waves brushing against the shore. The lights dimmed, casting a warm golden hue across the ballroom, soft enough to melt away the tension that had only moments ago filled the air. Edward Hamilton extended his hand toward Clara Evans. The sudden gesture made her furrow her brows slightly. But his gaze, both proud and earnest, left Clara with no reason to refuse. She placed her slender hand into his. The touch was brief, yet it sent an uncanny spark racing through them both. They stepped into the center of the hall. The crowd parted, opening space for the pair. For a moment, all eyes still followed them, but the murmur of voices faded into the distance. Only the music remained, along with footsteps and breath. Edward placed his hand on Clara's waist, leading the first step. His stride was steady, yet never forceful. Clara, hesitant at first, gradually found her rhythm within his hold. Her dress swirled softly, and the pearl necklace on her shoulders caught the light, scattering it into a faint arc like a slender galaxy encircling her. With every turn, they weren't simply dancing, they were probing, testing the fragile walls each had built. "Do you always think everything is a chess game?" Clara asked softly, her voice low enough for only him to hear. Edward tilted his head, his breath brushing her hair. "No, but in this world, if we don't calculate, we get crushed." Clara gave a faint laugh, her eyes gleaming. "Sometimes, letting go of the calculations is the only way to survive." They spun once more. Clara's gown flared wide, catching the light like a streak of fire. Edward tightened his grip slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "You once belonged to this world, didn't you? Before you walked away from it all?" The question made Clara pause for a heartbeat, but she quickly regained her step, her tone lower, as if burying a secret. "I once walked across this very dance floor, but not as anyone's ally. Back then, I was only an observer." Edward fell silent for a beat. The music continued, yet Clara's words echoed in his mind like a distant drum. He could sense in them the trace of a wound that had never closed. They kept turning, their steps weaving with the music. Yet the air between them had changed, both soft and taut. Every beat of the waltz was a silent question. Every meeting of their eyes was an unspoken collision. At the edge of the hall, Veronica Carter stood still. Her eyes followed them, the smile on her lips stiffening. In that dance, she recognized something she loathed: harmony. Without a single word, Edward and Clara were forming a bond beyond her control. The waltz rose toward its climax. Edward leaned closer, whispering so only Clara could hear. "I don't need anyone to save me, but tonight, perhaps I do need someone to stand beside me." Clara tilted her head slightly. Her eyes shimmered, both bitter and tender. She did not answer immediately, letting the rhythm pull them into another turn, as if the dance itself was holding her reply in silence. When the music ended, Edward and Clara stood still in the middle of the hall. Guests burst into applause, the sound pounding like heavy rain. But in each other's eyes, they saw no one else, only the fragile opening of a secret quietly laid bare. After the waltz, the atmosphere in the Sterling Hall completely shifted. As the applause faded, groups of guests began clustering together, engaging in lively conversations. However, the spotlight was no longer on Veronica Carter as before. Every gaze turned toward Edward Hamilton and Clara Evans, the pair who had just silenced the entire hall before igniting it again. A group of financial businessmen approached. Among them was Harold Pierce, chairman of an investment fund, short in stature but loud in voice. He flashed a polite smile, though his eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Edward, it's been a long time. And this is your new partner." Clara tilted her head slightly, her gaze direct. Edward smiled and answered, "Yes, this is Clara Evans. She has a fascinating perspective on many things our circles often overlook." A single introduction, brief yet like planting a flag on the chessboard. No longer the one who came along, but partner. The crowd murmured, a few glances subtly changing. Harold chuckled. "Oh, well, that's wonderful. We were just discussing the prospects of green technology. I wonder if Miss Evans has any thoughts." All eyes turned to Clara. For a moment, the tension was palpable, as if the spotlight had fixed itself on the main character on stage. Clara took a deep breath. Her heart raced, yet her voice was calm. Green technology is not just about profit. It is the only way to keep a business standing in the long run. If you're only thinking about the next 3 years, then ignore it. But if you're thinking about 30 years, then investing today is survival. Her words rang out clear and decisive. Everyone paused. Then a few voices of agreement followed. A young female executive nodded slightly, her eyes bright. Edward observed, the corner of his lips lifting. He saw that Clara did not tremble at all. She wasn't just standing next to him. She was stepping in and taking command of the conversation. Another man interjected, his tone tinged with sarcasm. But that sounds too idealistic. The market doesn't wait around. Clara turned toward him, her tone steady yet powerful. It's not idealism. It's reality. The reality is that the earth leaves us no other choice. Not every business will see it, but history will remember those who dared to go first. Her response landed like an arrow. The crowd erupted, several eyes shifting from doubt to respect. Edward added, his voice deep and firm, "That's why I chose a partner like her, because I need someone who sees beyond immediate profit." Clara glanced at him briefly, her eyes carrying a trace of surprise, not because of the compliment, but because of how he placed her on equal ground. From the corner of the room, Veronica watched. Her hand gripped her glass so tightly her fingers left marks. She realized the narrative was slipping beyond her control. All the attention, all the conversations that should have been hers now revolved around that mysterious woman. The energy escalated. Questions and answers followed, back and forth like volleys on a court. Clara did not dodge. Each of her statements was concise and sharp, always emphasizing one key phrase, long term. She repeated it 3 times, like etching it into the listeners' minds. At last, a brief silence fell before Harold burst into hearty laughter. "Miss Evans, I must admit, you remind me why we need people who dare to speak plainly." Laughter spread. The atmosphere lightened. But it was unmistakable the balance of the hall had shifted. Edward and Clara were no longer guests under scrutiny. They were the ones steering the conversation. The music in the Sterling Hall kept playing, the waltz soft like a velvet layer over an already cracked atmosphere. But beneath that surface, tension swelled, waiting for a fissure to burst it open. Edward Hamilton had just finished a conversation with a group of guests when he caught Veronica Carter's gaze. That look was no longer a proud smile. It was a dagger hidden in silk, cold and direct. She stepped closer, the hem of her red dress brushing the marble floor. Her slim hand lightly touched his sleeve, a discreet gesture no one noticed. But Edward understood. It was an invitation, or rather, an unspoken command. "Come out to the balcony," Veronica whispered, her voice as smooth as honey, but with a metallic aftertaste. Edward glanced at Clara. She gave a slight nod, eyes cautious. Then he followed Veronica through the crowd. The glass door opened and closed behind them. The space changed instantly. Outside, the night wind bit, and the city lights cast against Veronica's face, turning her smile into something both beautiful and dangerous. She turned her back for a moment, as if giving him time to feel the imbalance, then faced him again, a slow smile spreading across her lips. "Edward," she said, enunciating each word, "you still like making an entrance, don't you? Bringing a waitress to my party. Is that your way of getting revenge?" Edward did not avoid the question. He stood upright, his voice lowering. "I don't need to get revenge. I just want you to see that I didn't come here alone." Veronica's eyes narrowed, a flash of contempt appearing. "Is that what you think actually? You're still alone, because you never learned how to stand without clinging to someone." Her words fell like drops of acid, corrosive and burning. Edward felt his chest tighten, yet the reply that left his mouth was calmer than he expected. "I've stood alone for too long. Veronica, you know the cost, but tonight, I choose not to stand alone anymore." The space between them was taut like a stringed instrument. Veronica chuckled softly, but the smile never reached her eyes. "You're jealous, Edward. Jealous that I built an empire from the ashes you left. Jealous that now the hall's attention isn't on you. They're only curious about the woman at your side. Edward clenched his fist, his jaw tightening. But instead of roaring, he spoke slowly, each word deliberate. I'm not jealous. I'm angry. Angry because you always want to control everything from the company to this hall, even to me. And now, you want to control Clara, too. Clara's name rang out on the balcony like a challenge. Veronica's smile froze for a moment. She stepped closer, eyes icy. You don't know who she is, Edward. She doesn't belong to this world. And when the truth comes out, she will drag you down. Trust me. The wind whistled through the door crack, a sound that cut the air. Edward stepped forward, closing the distance to within a single breath. His eyes did not blink, his voice low and sounding like an alarm bell. I will not let her become a puppet, and I am no longer a puppet in anyone's hands, not even yours. Veronica fell silent, her lips trembling briefly before pressing together. Then she gave a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Fine. But remember this, Edward, every flame has its price. Once it burns, it will consume you. With that, she turned on her heel and walked back inside, the red of her dress trailing in the city light. Edward stood motionless. His heart pounded, his breathing rapid. He leaned his hand on the cold railing, closing his eyes. Veronica's words spun in his head. But beneath everything, one thing was clearer than ever: he would not step back. Not this time. The glass door closed behind Veronica, leaving Edward standing alone on the balcony. The New York night breeze slipped through, chilly, carrying the damp scent of the river. The city light stretched out like a sea of stars at his feet, yet inside, he was still unsettled by the words she had just spoken. He turned and walked back inside. In the hall, the music had shifted, and the guests were still lively. Clara stood near the buffet table, chatting with a group of young guests. Her calm demeanor eased him somewhat, but from across the room, Veronica was still watching, her eyes like a pair of shears waiting for the moment to cut the fragile thread between them. Soon enough, she approached the group. This time, her voice rang clear, no longer hidden. Edward, you certainly have an eye to bring someone special like Miss Evans here. But I still wonder how many people in this room actually know exactly who she is. The group froze. Curious eyes immediately turned toward Clara. Whispers spread, thin as silk threads, but together they wove into a web. Clara lifted her head, her expression unchanged. I never intended to hide who I am, she said, her voice steady and slow. Veronica sneered, raising her glass, the light catching through the deep red liquid. Really, I seem to recall hearing that name back at Harvard, and then vanished. The rumors back then weren't exactly flattering. The murmurs grew louder. Some faces turned to exchange looks. Several gazes shifted from surprise to suspicion. Edward cut in at once, his tone firm. Veronica, if you want to use the past as a weapon, remember you also have plenty of things you wouldn't want brought up. The air thickened. Clara tilted her head slightly, her eyes glancing at Edward with a look both grateful and unreadable. Veronica remained composed. She lowered her glass, her words a whisper, but loud enough for those around to hear. Edward, you might protect her tonight, but you cannot stop the world from asking questions tomorrow. The chandelier lights fell across Clara's face. For a moment, she seemed separated from the crowd, alone under the weight of their scrutiny. A chill ran down her spine, yet she drew in a deep breath, her hand tightening around the pearl necklace at her throat as if holding on to an anchor. I'm not afraid of questions, Clara replied, her voice now sharper, clearer. What I fear is silence, because silence is how the powerful cover up their mistakes. A hush spread. Then suddenly, a few claps broke out. From the corner of the room, a young female director stood and nodded at Clara. The applause spread not loud, but enough to ease some of the suffocating tension. Veronica's lips curled, but this time the smile carried a bitter shade. She stepped back, letting the crowd wrestle with the fresh curiosity she had sown. Edward moved closer, his voice low, meant only for Clara. "You don't have to carry all of this." Clara turned, her gaze resolute. "You're wrong. I once ran away. Now, I don't run anymore." At that moment, Edward realized that no matter how many doubts Veronica had tried to cast, Clara had chosen to face them, and that choice, fragile as it was, had become her strength. Dear listener, can you feel the chill in the air when a single question, small as it may seem, shifts the eyes of an entire hall? If it were you, how would you face it when your past is laid bare before hundreds of watching eyes? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to continue journeying with stories rich in emotion, surprises, and healing like this one, don't forget to subscribe to The Soft Why. Every bit of your support is the very strength that allows us to keep telling stories that touch the heart. The atmosphere in the Sterling Hall had yet to calm down after Clara's sharp rebuttal. The scattered applause earlier was like small sparks, but in the corners of the room, whispers still spread. Doubtful, curious, and even disdainful gazes intertwined like invisible blades. Clara felt them cutting into her skin, yet she stood tall, her hands still clutching the pearl necklace, as if binding herself not to tremble. Then suddenly, a man appeared at the doorway. He wore a gray suit, holding a briefcase in his hand. His demeanor evoked the image of an investigator or a seasoned journalist. The sound of his shoes striking the marble floor echoed so sharply that the entire hall fell silent. "Sorry for the interruption," he said in a husky, steady voice. "But perhaps it's time a few truths were spoken." Veronica Carter frowned slightly. Edward Hamilton froze, and Clara's heart pounded as if a door to the past was about to burst open. The man opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "My name is Daniel Ross, an independent journalist. For the past 2 years, I have been investigating shady financial activities surrounding Sterling Corporation, and one name kept appearing in the files." The murmurs grew louder. Daniel raised the first page, the light catching the words clearly, "Clara Evans." The entire hall seemed frozen. Clara took a deep breath, but her hand remained firmly on the pearls, refusing to step back. Daniel continued, 10 years ago, Clara Evans was an economics student at Harvard. She discovered that Sterling was laundering money through fake charities. She tried to present the evidence to the university board, but the report was buried. From then on, Clara disappeared from the academic world and was branded as someone who dropped out. But the truth is, she had faced a force far greater than herself. His words fell like a hammer blow. The guests turned to stare at Clara, this time not only with curiosity, but with astonishment. Veronica burst out laughing, her voice sharp. "Nonsense, this is nothing but a cheap fabrication. If she really had evidence, why wait until now to come forward?" Daniel remained unshaken. He pulled out a second stack of papers. "It turns out, the funds were funneled through 3 shell companies. It turns out, the confirming signatures match Sterling's people. And it turns out, Clara is the one holding the last legal copy." The 3 times "it turns out" echoed, etched deeply into everyone's ears. Each time, the hall swelled with stronger whispers. Clara closed her eyes for a brief moment. She remembered those sleepless nights 10 years ago, clutching the files as she fled the dormitory, fear pressing so heavily it was suffocating. And now, it was all reliving. But instead of bowing her head, she lifted it, her voice calm. "Yes, I once ran away, but the evidence still exists. I will no longer remain silent." Edward looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of shock and pain. He had never known Clara bore such a wound. Now he understood that the strength in her gaze was not only pride, but also the scar of the past. Veronica's face went pale. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted her glass of wine. The false smile could no longer conceal her unease. In the hall, the whispers had risen into a wave. Someone exclaimed, "If this is true, Sterling will collapse." Another nodded, "Now I understand why she's been so calm." Clara stood firm, bathed in the dazzling lights and surrounded by wavering eyes. Inside her, the fear had not fully faded, but a sense of relief slowly spread at last. The truth was no longer buried. The Sterling Hall still buzzed after Daniel Ross's revelation. Whispers bounced against the high ceiling and echoed back, filling the space with a sense of chaos. Veronica Carter tried to hold on to her smile, but the wine glass in her hands trembled slightly, the red liquid rippling. The entire empire she had built was shaking right in the middle of the evening that should have been her most glorious. Edward Hamilton felt as if he had been thrown straight into the storm. He looked at Clara Evans, the woman he had thought of just yesterday as an unexpected chess piece for his counterattack. But now, under the light of truth, it was clear she was not a chess piece, nor a shadow. She was a witness, a flame once extinguished, but still burning hot enough to ignite the entire room. He stepped closer, his voice low but resolute. "Why didn't you tell me from the start?" Clara lifted her gaze, her eyes still trembling with the weight of old memories. "Because I didn't trust you. Because once, I trusted someone, and the price I paid was 10 years of living like a fugitive." Edward was stunned. Her words cut into his pride like a blade. He had believed himself to be the only one carrying scars from the past with Veronica. But Clara, too, carried wounds deeper and longer lasting than he had imagined. "Clara," he began, but she cut him off, her voice slow and steady. "I don't need anyone to save me. I've repeated that to myself for years just to keep from collapsing. But tonight, I realized something. Not needing to be saved doesn't mean I have to be alone." In that moment, Edward felt his chest tighten. Her words spread through him like a hand splashing cold water, clearing away the fog in his mind. He gently touched her shoulder, not forcefully, just as a quiet affirmation. "From now on, not alone." The words rang out softly, but clear enough for Clara to hear. In her eyes flickered a glint not of immediate trust, but the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart for so many years. Daniel Ross still stood nearby, watching. He gave a small nod, like a man witnessing two pieces finally finding their place. "If the two of you stand together, the chance of bringing the truth to light will be greater than anything either of you could do alone." Edward turned to Clara, his gaze unwavering. "We do this together, not for revenge, but so that justice will no longer be buried." Clara drew in a breath and nodded. "I agree, but remember, I don't need anyone to rescue me. I need someone to walk beside me." Those words laid the foundation for an alliance. No papers, no signatures, only two people, both wounded, choosing to stand side by side. Across the hall, Veronica still fought to cling to control. She forced her voice out, strained. "Don't be fooled. The two of them are just putting on a show to sabotage me." But what once sounded like authority now rang hollow, like rusted metal. The crowd's attention was no longer on her. They looked instead at Edward and Clara not as victims, but as those rewriting the play right before their eyes. In that moment, an alliance was born, not from schemes, but from trust rekindled out of ruins. And both of them knew storms still lay ahead. But at least they would no longer walk alone. The Sterling night did not end with applause, but with stormy glances. Clara Evans and Edward Hamilton left the hall in silence, but in their hearts they both knew the storm had only just begun. The next morning, the New York sky was gray, fog draped thick like a curtain foreshadowing bad omens. Edward had barely stepped out of his apartment when the phone rang. Breaking through the air, he heard the voice of a familiar associate, hoarse with anger. "Have you seen the morning paper yet? The entire front page is about you and Miss Evans." Edward grabbed the newspaper delivered right at his door. On the cover, the bold headline slashed like a knife, "Millionaire Hamilton returns, hand in hand with a woman of a shadowy past." The photo captured Clara in the very moment she stood under the chandelier. Her face calm but now branded with the caption, "Opportunist." Before he could breathe, his email inbox exploded. Anonymous letters. Their words cold and threatening. "Stop, or the truth will bury both of you." Short sentences, but heavy like bricks, hurled straight into his chest. Edward felt his chest tighten. He turned to Clara, who was holding her phone, her eyes darkening as she read a similar message. "They don't want the truth to come out," she whispered, her voice rough, but her eyes ablaze. Before they could even discuss it, a large envelope arrived, with no sender. Inside was a golden embossed card. "Mr. Hamilton and Miss Evans are cordially invited to Sterling's charity gala this weekend. An opportunity to clarify the truth." 3 hammer blows fell in succession, the article. The threats, the invitation. Each strike was short and precise, leaving the two of them nearly breathless. Edward sank into his chair, gripping the edge of the table tightly. Inside his mind, anger and unease surged like a storm. This is no longer just a battle of words. This is war. Clara stood by the window, looking down at the hurried crowd on the street. Within her, a familiar feeling resurfaced, the memory from 10 years ago, when every door slammed shut, when rumors devoured her name. But this time was different. She was no longer alone. "We have to go," she said. Turning back, her voice did not tremble. Only certainty remained. Edward looked at her, his eyes heavy with worry. "That's clearly a trap." "Maybe," Clara replied. "But if we don't step in, they'll have the excuse to say we're afraid. The truth will be twisted even further." He fell silent, weighing it. Worry hung thick like the gray clouds outside, but amid the storm, Clara's words rang like an anchor. She was no longer avoiding, and he could not let her face this alone. "Fine," Edward said, his voice heavy but resolute. "If this is a trap, we'll turn it into a stage. Do they want it public? We'll make everything public." In the quiet room, Clara gave a slight nod. Their eyes met. No further promises needed. An alliance forged the night before was now being tested by fire. Outside, the media storm still rolled in waves, but inside, a quiet determination locked firmly into place. They would not back down. The charity gala that weekend arrived faster than they had imagined. The Sterling Hall was more magnificent than ever, chandeliers ablaze. A red carpet stretched long, and dozens of reporters crowded outside. Every camera lens was fixed on the main doors, as if waiting for a dramatic moment. Edward Hamilton and Clara Evans entered together. They were no longer the surprising pair who disrupted the hall the other night, but two people walking side by side with a clear decision they would confront openly. Veronica Carter stood at the center, radiant in a shimmering gown. Her smile was like a blade wrapped in velvet. When she saw Edward and Clara, her eyes flickered with challenge, quickly masked by warmth. "Edward, Clara!" Veronica's voice rang out, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Perfect timing. This is just the moment for us to clear up a few rumors." A ripple of whispers spread out. Cameras flashed nonstop. Clara took a deep breath, feeling every beat of her heart. But this time, she did not step back. Veronica signaled. A large screen lit up, projecting a series of images of Clara, accompanied by slanderous words: "College dropout, saboteur Hamilton's opportunistic lover." The crowd stirred, and a few mocking laughs broke out. Edward clenched his fists. He stepped forward, his voice firm. "Enough, Veronica. If you want it public, then we'll make everything public." He gave a nod to Daniel Ross, who had been prepared. Daniel opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick file, and held it up before the cameras. "Here is detailed evidence of Sterling's shell companies, along with 3 recordings of internal exchanges. They contain signatures, voices, and official legal seals." The hall fell silent. Daniel plugged a USB drive into the screen. Instantly, the smooth but calculating voice of an executive filled the air. "Transfer the money into the fake charity fund. Veronica will authorize the signature. The whispers grew frantic. Some guests covered their mouths. Others stared at each other in shock. Veronica's face paled, though she forced a smile. Forgery? These recordings could have been fabricated at any time. Clara stepped forward, her eyes shining cold. No, this is the original I've kept for 10 years. The truth doesn't disappear. It only waits for the right day to speak. And today, that day has come. The 3 times it turns out from before now echoed like the final hammer strike. No more whispers. This time the hall erupted in uproar. Edward fixed his gaze on Veronica, his voice sharp as steel. You thought no one would dare to resist you, but every cover-up has its end. Today is the end. The financial police, invited earlier by Daniel, marched in. Their footsteps struck the floor, firm and unyielding. An officer held out an arrest warrant. Veronica froze, her smile collapsing. The wine glass in her hand slipped, shattering across the marble floor. There was no escape. A cold pair of handcuffs locked around the very hands that once waved to thousands of admiring eyes. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing the downfall of an empire. The hall fell into a single beat of silence. Then the murmurs exploded. Someone whispered aloud, "Curtain down." Edward turned to Clara. In her eyes, tears welled but did not fall. He gently held her hand. Amid the chaos, only their silence rang out. The silence of justice restored. The silence of an old chapter closed. After the final curtain call echoed through the Sterling Hall, the gala dissolved like an unexpected rainstorm. The crystal chandeliers still blazed, but their brilliance no longer carried any grandeur. Instead, they illuminated stunned faces and hurried footsteps rushing out of the scene. And in the middle of it all, Edward Hamilton and Clara Evans still stood there, silent, hand in hand. Outside, New York lit up as usual, but within their hearts, a long chapter had just closed. Veronica Carter was led away, her shimmering metallic gown now nothing more than a costume from an old performance. The murmurs of the crowd slowly faded, leaving behind a profound silence. Edward sat down on the steps in front of the building, taking a deep breath. It's over, he whispered, as if reminding himself to believe in the truth. Clara sat beside him, her gaze reaching far into the distance. The golden glow of the streetlights fell across her face, gentle yet touched with fatigue. Do you feel lighter? She asked. Edward nodded slowly. Yes, but also empty. As if, after a storm, we are standing on bare sand, not knowing how to rebuild the house. Clara smiled softly. The house can be rebuilt. What matters is we're no longer alone. That sentence rang out like a small bell in the night. Edward turned, gazing deep into her eyes. In them, there was not only resilience, but also the tenderness of someone who had learned how to rise after breaking. They said nothing more. That silent moment itself was a promise that needed no paper or contract, only the understanding that from now on, the road ahead would be walked together. The next day, the news flooded every headline, but this time, the titles no longer smeared. Instead, bold letters declared Sterling collapses, money laundering exposed at gala. In the photo, Edward and Clara appear together, not as people under scrutiny, but as those who have stood for the truth. The crowd still debated, social media still divided, but in the midst of all that noise, the two of them found rare peace. One morning, Edward and Clara stood by the window of their high-rise apartment, watching the sun rise over the Hudson River. The first light of the new day streamed in, radiant, pushing away the darkness of the night before. Edward whispered, "From here, we begin again." Clara nodded, her voice warm and steady. From here, not alone. That image of two people once shattered, now finding each other in the morning light, felt like the perfect closing mark for the story. Dear listener, how do you feel at this point? Have you ever gone through a storm in your life where honor, love, or trust was tested to its limits? And after it all, did you find a hand to hold or a light to guide you out of the darkness? Share your own story in the comments, because every story, no matter how small, carries the power to heal someone who is lost. And if you feel Edward and Clara's journey touched your heart, don't forget to share this message and subscribe to the Soft Wide channel to continue hearing stories filled with emotions, surprises, and also the warmth of healing. Your companionship is the very reason we keep telling these stories.